Welcome to Global Insights channel, and today I'm very glad to host Dr. Marc Neugröschel from Institute for the Study of Antisemitism and based in Woolf Institute in Cambridge. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And we are talking today about very interesting topic about the anti-Semitism, the modern anti-Semitism, and maybe we touch some history of anti-Semitism. And the first question which I have to ask you, when we hear all the time people are saying Israel is apartheid state, what's that? I mean, is Israel an apartheid state, or it's just the anti-Semitism?
Apartheid refers and invokes a particular historical precedent where people of color were being discriminated based on a worldview that they are inferior. Now, while we certainly do have forms of racist discrimination in Israel, and this is undeniable, the ethos of Zionism and the idea based on which the State of Israel was being founded has nothing to do with ideas of white supremacy that were the foundation for systems of apartheid that we had in South Africa and even in the United States of America until 1964, right? Where people in certain areas were not allowed, people of color were not allowed to enter the store the same door that white people were entering. The fact that we do have discrimination, racist discrimination in Israel, is not based in this ideological worldview. In fact, the accusation that Israel is an apartheid state is not only a distortion of history, it's part of a more systematic demonization of the State of Israel that is aiming to portray the Jewish state as a symbol for crimes against humanity, as a symbol for unhuman or inhumane worldviews and attitudes. And in this respect, Israel is not only accused of being an apartheid state. Israel is being accused of being a fascist regime. Israel is sometimes accused of being a Nazi regime. Israel is being accused of being a racist regime. And the very founding ethos of the Jewish state, Zionism, is equated with all these ideologies. The ideologies of racism, the ideologies of Nazism, the ideology of fascism, right? First of all, this is historically absolutely inaccurate. Secondary, this is a deliberate distortion based on a demonization that follows a certain anti-Semitic patterns.
So is this demonization of Israel and of Zionism, actually,
in short, yes.
It's a kind of anti-Semitism?
In short, yes.
All the well-known anti-Semitism, just in a new form.
It is an adaptation of anti-Semitism. Look, the core of anti-Semitism is basically to portray expressions of Jewish life as a symbol of evil. The ideas of what is evil in the world changes with history, right? So today we live in a world when we speak about liberal, left-wing, or also like political central discourse, where we associate evil, and I would say rightfully so, with Nazism, with apartheid, with fascism, right? So in a way, the consistent adaptation of anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews and the Jewish state represents evil, is being expressed in the way of accusing Israel of all these crimes of humanity. And we have to pay attention that when Israel is being accused of an apartheid state, when Zionism is called a form of racism or fascism, this is not the criticism of instances of racism or the instances or of fascist ideas that certainly do exist in Israel as they exist anywhere else, right? It is an equation between Israel and Zionism per se with those crimes against humanity, right? So it's one thing to say we have like cases of racism in Israel, which we certainly do.
As we probably have in the United States and the United Kingdom.
We have them everywhere
it's
in the world.
It's not that special.
Exactly, right? And there is discrimination in Israel of all kind of people. There is a situation that, for example, Arabs who live in the West Bank have not the same right as Jews that live in the West Bank. There is social discrimination of all kind of forms, right? So you can say there are these forms of discrimination, right? And you can criticize them. But saying Zionism is Nazism, or Zionism is fascism, or Zionism is an apartheid means to take the entire ideology, the entire founding ethos of the Jewish state, to take the state per se and turn it into a symbol per se for this ideology.
And also what I think is we should always remember that in fact Israel, after all the criticism we may have on Israel, is the only democratic state in the Middle East. And if you compare Israel to any other country in the Middle East, it's the only democracy.
This is
and if you speak about discrimination, you can compare it with any other Arab country, then the situation in Israel is the best compared to its
I agree,
neighbors.
and this is the reason why, first of all, these accusations, Zionism is racism, Israel is an apartheid state, and so on, this is why they're historically and politically inaccurate. But what I'm saying that, in addition, they're not only inaccurate, they follow an anti-Semitic pattern of demonization. And this form of adaptation, of translating the basic idea of anti-Semitism, the Jews represent evil, into the more adapted idea that Zionism represents fascism or apartheid, has actually been pioneered in the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and the early 70s, when Stalin's so-called Zionologists redefined the term of Zionism into from it actually is and represents the Jewish national ethos, the idea of Judaism as a nationality, striving for emancipation, striving to find a solution for the problem that Jews have permanently been persecuted, right? And turning it into a symbol for crimes against humanity. So what we see today in contemporary discourse is actually very much a replication, right, of these anti-Zionist demonization that we had, that was dominantly disseminated by the Soviets in the 60s and the 70s. Now, I want to say one more thing. There are plenty of ways to criticize, right, the factual racist discriminations that we do have in Israel, right, and other things that go wrong in Israel. Just equating, right, Israel and Zionism with these crimes against humanity, right, has nothing to do with a fact-based criticism of like things that are actually really happening in Israel, but they amount to turning Israel into a symbol, and this is exactly where things go and turn to be anti-Semitic.
And what you mentioned, the Soviet propaganda, and as someone who was born in the Soviet Union, I remember very well all these propaganda posters, which is, we're always trying to portray the Nazis and the Zionists as the same. Even visuals were just like the same. Exactly. So it's just a cheap Soviet propaganda. It's very funny when you come to the streets in London and you see now this propaganda
and what
repeated
in
the United Kingdom.
In the streets of London as well is, say, you know, like and even like here in Cambridge, Zionism is like equated with imperialism, right? The struggle against Israel is equated with a struggle against the bourgeoisie. So we really see like a very clear replication of the ideas that were disseminated in anti-Zionist Soviet propaganda, basically again turning the state of Israel and turning Zionism into a symbol for crimes against humanity, or more particular speaking, for what the Soviets considered to be like crimes against humanity, or you know, like simply speaking, the bad things in the world.
Let's go back to the history. When the modern anti-Semitism had begun?
Look, I think there are not really very clear distinctions between certain phases of anti-Semitism, right? In general, we can actually say that anti-Semitism is a consistent worldview, right? Consistent not in terms of like, you know, that it's true or that it makes sense, but consistent in so far that it has like its own view of the world that is like in a steady way being applied to interpret reality, right? And that the basis of this anti-Jewish worldview has not really changed for more than 2,000 years, right? With early Christianity, there was the idea that Judaism is something like a moral countermodel, right? Jews were being portrayed as the murderers of Jesus Christ, as the murderers of the figures that symbolized the divinity, that symbolized God, right? So in this respect, Jews were framed as I said before, a moral countermodel. And this basic idea has consistently been applied as this idea has been projected to interpret changing forms of political reality. What has changed in anti-Semitism throughout the ages is not the underlying assumptions of the anti-Jewish worldview, but the political and cultural realities that are interpreted further to the anti-Semitic view, right? So in a period where society was basically organized religiously, right? Jews were portrayed as the murderers of God, right? In a society where the instance of evil, what happened in history, is like rightfully like seen in Nazism, right? Then Zionism is like portrayed as Nazism, right? So we have like for the anti-communists in 20th century Russia, right? Or like 19th century, 20th century Russia, Jews were responsible for communism, right? For the Nazis, Jews were responsible for communism. Now, for the anti-communists, for the communists, Jews and Zionists in Israel are made responsible for anti-communism. The Nazis accused the Jews of both communism and capitalism, right? So we really see how this basic idea, Jews are evil, Jews are bad, are adapted to changing ideas of good and evil. So again, what changes is not the basic assumption of the anti-Semitic worldview. What changes are the realities, the social realities, the political realities that are interpreted further to anti-Semitic terms. The researcher Monika Schwarz-Friesel has coined, together with Yehuda Reinhardt, the metaphor of anti-Semitism as a chameleon that changes its color according to the circumstances but stays the same at its core. And I think that's a very appropriate way to describe what anti-Semitism is about. An unchanging set of views that take a different appearance depending on which realities are interpreted further to this anti-Semitic view. And we have to understand that we basically have the same schemes of interpretation both on the left and on the right. Right? So, for example, where people on the left accuse Jews and Zionists in Israel for being responsible for apartheid, for fascism, for racism, identifying Israel and Zionism with these ideas, because these are the ideas that they reject and that they fight, right? On the far right, Zionism is made responsible for immigration, right? And for the fact that societies in the Western world are not homogeneically white, right? Because from a far-right perspective, from a racist perspective, this is a major grievance, right? So we can really see this adaptability that different groups, people with different political affiliation, use Zionism and Israel and manifestations of Jewish life as a symbol, right, for what they consider to be wrong in the world. And that's how we get to a situation where Jews are being made up, where Zionism is being equated with capitalism, with communism, with racism, but also like with immigration, right, depending on who applies this worldview.
So we are accused in all sins.
Exactly.
I have a question. The term anti-Semitism, when it comes up, when it first appears?
So, according to what the historical research on the matter suggests, the term anti-Semitism has basically been coined by a German political activist and journalist and author called Wilhelm Marr, who in 1879 co-founded the so-called League of Anti-Semites in Berlin, right? So here you can already see that the term anti-Semitism was not kind of like a descriptive term for a phenomenon or some kind of accusation where people would point to someone and say like, you're an anti-Semitism, and people would say, no, I'm not, right? It was people committed to be anti-Semites, right? It was a self-ascribed ideology of people who were actually proud to be anti-Semitic, right? Because they actually accused who they called Semites, but in fact, like, they meant Jews, to be responsible for what is wrong in society. Now, for example, in the case of German society and the term anti-Semitism, the Association of Anti-Semites was founded in Germany. It was believed that Jews are responsible for the fact that there's no coherent, no consistent German national identity. The reason for that, according to the anti-Semitic logic, was that the Jews kind of oust or eliminate all moral values that, based on which such a sense of national solidarity could potentially emerge, right? So here again we see how this idea of Jews as a moral countermodel, right, is being applied to explain a particular grievance.
But why to use this old-fashioned term Semites, Semites, instead of using anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish,
very good question.
anti-Jew?
Very good question. First of all, we have to understand there's no thing like Semitism or there's no thing like Semites, right? The word Semitic is actually from the realm of language research, right? It refers to Semitic languages, basically Hebrew and Arabic, right? Now, in the context of the League of Anti-Semites, it was very clear that they had no business with the Arabs, right? And that they didn't care about the Arabs. And in fact, if we read the writings of Wilhelm Marr, and if we read the statutes of the League of Anti-Semites, right, it explicitly targets Jews, right? And just like occasionally uses the word Semites as a synonym for Jews. So it's a very good question. Why do they do that? Because the anti-Semites, the self-declared anti-Semites, wanted to give themselves an appearance of being modern, of being liberal, of being emancipated, and of having not anything to do with traditional Jew hatred. The inventor of the term anti-Semitism, Wilhelm Marr, was a secularist. He was, in many respects, progressive. He was a radical Democrat. He was associated with a lot of progressive left-wing, far-left, underground political associations. He was like a critic of the monarchy. He was very often in conflict with a monarchic, with a feudal political leaders that ruled Germany back then. And he saw himself as a progressive secularist, right, who didn't want to have to do anything with what, was considered like religious bigotry, right? So he basically needed a new term to frame anti-Semitism as something today we would say is politically correct, right? It's very interesting, for example, Wilhelm Marr said, and he wrote that explicitly in his writings, that the accusation that the Jews murdered Jesus Christ is stupid. He literally uses the German word blödsinnig, stupid, right? Instead, however, he accuses the Jews of what he calls social nihilism, this emanating social nihilism, right? So again, he takes this idea of Jews as a moral countermodel, of Jews as heretics, right? Who reject God, but applies it to a secular framework, right? So instead of saying, Jews murdered God, he says like, this is stupid, but Jews are actually nihilists in a different kind of way, and so far that they contravene the social values that would integrate a society and like lead to a moral society. And this is the reason why in Germany we don't have like a moral society, or we don't have like a German national identity, right? That was the idea. So in a way, to make it short, the idea was to reframe anti-Judaism in politically correct terms. So in a way, the term anti-Semitism in the 19th century, and also we can say still in the 20th century, played the exact same role that anti-Zionism plays today. Because what is communicated under the term anti-Zionism today has nothing to do with a criticism of Zionism for what Zionism really is, right? There was critique of Zionist ideas within Jewish society, who had like different visions by people who had like different visions of Jewish emancipation or like ways to achieve equal Jewish rights other than the Zionists, right? But the way the term anti-Zionism is being used today is basically predicated on the Soviet redefinition of the term, right? Where the meaning of the term Zionism has been changed from actually signifying the ethos of the Jewish national movement to like being turned into a symbol for crimes against humanity, right? So we would say that the way the term anti-Zionism is being used today has as little to do with what Zionism actually meant as the term Semitism has actually to do with the original meaning of the Semitic languages, right? So we have, like in both cases, a redefinition of terms, right? That is being used to reframe an idea that in its core actually stays the same.
I want to ask you an interesting question for me, because I see the extreme right-wing parties like FPU in Austria or AfD even in Germany. And let's say the very right-wing parties, and many would say even the new neo-Nazi movements. I don't know how if it can be justified or not, but this is not for the matter of this conversation, but they're very, even the German people and Austrian people are afraid of these parties. But, you know, we expect from these parties to present anti-Semitic agenda. And in fact, many of them nowadays support Israel.
Well, I think the far right is in this respect, first of all, a bit diverse, right? We have like anti-Israel voices in the far right, and we have like self-declared pro-Israel voices in the far right. Now, a lot of the support, or the alleged support for Israel that we have among the far right, is basically based on the fact that the far right tries to use it as an alibi for racist discrimination of Muslims and immigrants, right? They portray Israel, so to speak, like a counter model to Muslim, to Arabs, like to the kind of immigrants that they don't want, right? And therefore, right, claim to actually support Israel. Now, we have to understand that in a way, by doing so, they reaffirm the same anti-Semitic stereotypes that we have among the left and the liberal discourse, right? Because people on the left and liberals, they would say like Zionism is a form of fascism, racism, right? And in a way, some people on the far right would actually agree with that, but say this is actually a good thing, right?
For us, it's a good.
So for us, it's a good thing.
But both sides come from the anti-Semitic view.
So in a way, much of their self-declared pro-Israelism is actually based on the very same anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic stereotypes that we also have like among the left and the liberal discourse. In addition to that, there is a lot of like support or like self-declared support for Israel among evangelicals, like far-right Protestants, like in the United States. Now, also this is a bit, it's not clear-cut, right? It's a bit complicated because there are certainly certain circles that are very true friends of Israel. However, the traditional support, quote unquote, for Israel that we have in these evangelical circles is based on a theological idea that the second coming of the Messiah will occur when all Jews live actually in Israel, right? And then in the theological vision, the Jews will eventually disappear and everybody will actually become Christian, right?
Jews should be converted at the end.
Right. So this is not like a genuinely like pro-Jewish vision, right? It's basically like a means to an end, like of a vision where in the end of the day Jews disappear.
Yeah, it's kind of doomsday vision.
Exactly. However, it also has to be pointed out that, like, social realities sometimes decompartmentalize from the ideological roots that bring them about, right? So I wouldn't say that all the far right, or I wouldn't say that all the Protestants, right, that all the evangelicals today in the United States that are pro-Israel actually really anticipate the disappearance of the Jews, right? So there are certainly certain instances where, based on this ideology, a genuine friendship and a genuine empathy and genuine like emotional connection with people in Israel has emerged in the Protestant camp, right? That became like independent from its theological roots, right? But at the same time, we should not forget the theological roots and should forget that like much of this pro-Israelism is actually based on a vision that in the end actually projects or like envisions the disappearance of all the Jews.
Yeah, so it's complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, that's true, yeah.
That's true.
Anti-Semitism has always been a phenomenon that emanated from the mainstream and, in fact, intellectual elites. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, it were the Christian preachers, people like Ambrosius and Chrysostomos, who preached anti-Semitic ideas and that way brought them into society. In Nazi Germany, when we had the book burnings were initiated actually by student movements. The universities in Germany were actually the first institution that excluded Jews before it was even legally required. And the group, the professional group in Germany with the highest share of members in the Nazi Party were actually medical doctors. So we can see that anti-Semitism was always disseminated by the intellectual elites and by the mainstream of society, not necessarily by the margins of society. And this is a phenomenon that is continuing today, right? So today we see how anti-Semitism is predominantly disseminated by intellectual elites, by students, by university professors all over the world.
Dr. Marc Neugröschel, thank you very much. And of course, you are a research fellow in the Institute for the Study of the Antisemitism and Global Policy and in Woolf Institute here in Cambridge. Thank you very much. And guys, thank you for being on Global Insights. Stay tuned, and to the protesters, think twice before you protest against Israel, not to be on the evil side of the history. And thank you again.
Thank you.